Hello, and welcome to another episode of Civic Punks. I am very, very excited today to be joined by Michael Wernick. Michael, actually, when I first joined government, was the head of the public service, and I had this really interesting run-in. I don't know if you remember this, Michael, but I actually bumped into you on an elevator in my first week in the office, and we were in the elevator together, and you're like, oh, hey, welcome to the government. You were very friendly. It was quite nice. So it's kind of weird to have that sort of full circle moment and have you join us now. And I'm also joined by Raihana, who is helping me with this research, and I'm very excited to have her here as well. Michael, why don't I give you a second to sort of introduce yourself. Tell us more about who you are and how you came into government.
Well, I started in the government of Canada straight out of grad school about 4 decades ago. And from a technology point of view, before the internet, before fax machines, before desktops. So I've seen the whole wave of government technology come and go. I was in executive positions in different departments through the 90s and aughts and beyond. And I was deputy minister at the department then called Indian and Northern Affairs for 8 years through, I guess, the early part of the century. I ended up back at PCO for the 4th time as clerk and cabinet secretary for the first of Justin Trudeau's 3 mandates. And since 2019, I've been on the outside looking at government from the perspective of the University of Ottawa, who have been good enough to give me a chair where I can think and write and talk to people about public sector management.
Well, I've been very fortunate to have many conversations with you over the years, particularly more recently about some of your thinkings and musings about where you think the public service should go, some of your concerns about some of the shortcomings that we currently have with how we set up our public service. But for today, I actually want to go a bit back into the past, because there's a question that I've been wrestling with, which is Canada's e-government rankings, the United Nations e-government rankings. So this really a really admired set of rankings that a lot of people pay attention to. And we were really good. We were 3rd in 2010, and then we've dropped down to 47th as of last year. So it's a massive drop. And really this curiosity of trying to figure out what's going on. Why is it that despite everything that we've been doing in Canada, and we've been doing a lot of stuff, why is it that we continue to fall? And so I guess that's where I want to start. Going back to the period of time leading up, so that we were 3rd in 2010, the 2000 to 2010, what was happening? What were we doing back then to get us to the place to be 3rd in the world? Like, from your perspective, what were the key things that we were doing then?
I'm not sure I have a clear diagnostic to it. I mean, I don't want to get into sort of methodological arguments, but what I would say about these sort of ranking tables is that they're always generally right about direction, and they tell you something worth exploring, as we're doing today. But they're always relative measures. So, there's a pack of countries out there, and one of the things that may have been happening is that other countries, caught up by putting in a lot of effort and investment, and the spread between the top and the bottom is no doubt changed. And I think that there are different characteristics to some of the technological waves that we went through, which, there are people more expert than I, but you can sort of broadly lump them into the adoption of, the first generation internet and then sort of two-way internet. Then we get smartphones arriving around 2007 and people start thinking in terms of apps. We saw the availability of cloud computing arrive. Workplace tools really accelerated during the pandemic. We're all on Teams and Zoom calls now. And now we're seeing, sort of the crusting of a wave around AI. And each of those has a slightly different characteristic. So I guess what you're seeing in 2010 is a little bit of a lagged effect of a lot of effort, and success around first and second generation internet, which really was a big priority at the time. And it had some strong leadership. We can sort of come back to that. But I remember being an ADM and a deputy and being drawn into, all kinds of initiatives of cutting across the government. First version was government online, basically moving as many outside transactional services to the internet as possible. A lot of concern behind the scenes about cybersecurity even back then. So, you can find people from that era who would have been working on what they called secure channel. There's a big trust issue there about tax information and transactional information, going into an online environment. And so, secure channels, privacy, data protection, being concerns ever since, the very beginning of this. And then, it's set in Canada, which is like 6 time zones and 40 degrees of latitude and a lot of geography. So it's not disconnected from a sort of the national agenda of rolling out 3G, 4G, 5G sort of cell phone coverage, getting closer and closer to universal access. There are still, gaps, but a lot of the debates in the 2010s were about sort of closing the gap for people that just, could not take full advantage of e-health and e-government and distance learning and so on. We're now up to, well into the 90s on people's access to, broadband and smartphones and so on. But we're not at 100, and we probably never will be.
I want to dig into this a little bit more. So if you look at the e-government rankings, it's actually coming together of three different rankings that are kind of averaged out. One of them focuses really on the amount of services that are available digitally.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the digital service ranking. The second ranking is really about human capital, which is humans, the level of digital literacy within the population. And the third one is about technical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And and then three of those come together to form those rankings. So in 2010, we were very high. We were one of the strongest in all three of those areas. What do you think happened to enable us to, in many ways, I think you made a point earlier that I think is true, which is that we were one of the first movers in this space, and then the rest of the world's caught up, which is very much, if you look at the rankings, like the actual score between 2010 and 2024 of us in those rankings is actually stable and with a slight incline. What's happened, to your point, is that the rest of the world's caught up. So what I'm really interested in sort of this first section is to figure out, like, what was it that caused us to be a first mover? How did we get ahead of the rest of the world on these three areas, particularly looking at, let's start with the first one, moving services to be delivered digitally?
I think there was clearly some focus and an attention and some political cover from the Chrétien and Harper governments. I think they were quick to see that this would be important to move as many as possible of the sort of front-end transactional services to convenience and provide, the sort of 724 kinds of services and the customization and the flexibility and so on, because it makes voters happy, which always motivates government. And I think that's always the leading edge. It's easier to get governments interested in putting, a smart chatbot on a service window and deal with, transactional backlogs like passports and EI claims and so on, because that's where the voter feedback comes from. I think what you would probably see if you did it carefully is a bit of a lag between the outside part of government and the internal workings, which is one of my sort of constant rants, is that internally, while there have been some progress on moving to work program, the Wikipedia approaches and the GC collabs and the Teams and Zoom, the core software of finance and human resources and records management still, it's about 20 years old. And that, I think, has held back the ability to really take a bigger leap, even on the services point of view. We're both fans of the book Platform Land, and you couldn't build platform land on the government of Canada's information management and data systems right now. I don't know. I think the fiscal context probably changed. We should probably talk about that. There was a lot of strong leadership from people in key positions. I have to give a shout out to Kevin Lynch, who was a big advocate for government online in all the jobs that he had when he had the opportunities at finance and the clerkship. Wayne Waters provided very strong leadership at the Treasury Board when he was there, and a succession of people in key roles around the system. You had political cover, you had some investments at the right time, and you had some strong public service leadership at the time. So, oversimplifying it, I think we got the internet right, and we got the first generation of cybersecurity right. This is the part everybody forgets in hindsight, is, that early period brought us Chinese attacks on the National Research Council, theft of intellectual property from Nortel, denial of service attacks on the Department of Finance, and so on. So we've always had, within the Government of Canada, a deep sort of anxiety about cybersecurity and hacking and taking down of services, which actually was ahead of the curve. We were actually well ahead of the Brits and the Americans and the Europeans on this for a while. Part of the origin story of Shared Services Canada, which I know is a controversial topic in Canada, is actually the cybersecurity angle. It was about bringing government services within a firewall that could be protected. And we were successful in doing that, to the point where, people from the UK were coming to Canada to study the Canadian model. We were well ahead on a number of these aspects.
Hey, quick sidebar. Shared Services Canada. What is it? It's a department that was created in 2011 really to centralize and modernize the way the federal government did its IT infrastructure. The idea being that trying to do it individually within all these different departments would be complete chaos. If you put it into one spot, you get economies of scale, you get centralization of expertise, it would just lead to a better rollout. In theory, great idea. In practice, it's been a bumpy road. There's been a lot of Auditor General reports and Senate hearings that have dived into why SSC has not met this expectation. I can speak from personal experience that when I worked in the Government of Canada, SSC was oftentimes seen as a roadblock to transformation and digital innovation. And so we tried to work around it, instead focusing on sort of innovative spaces like Canadian Digital Services or some of the sort of frontline departments that had some great teams such as Transport Canada. And on the policy side, really the office, the Chief Information Officer within the Treasury Board Secretariat. So theory, great idea. Practice, not so much. Just want to do a quick sidebar because Michael's going to talk a bunch about SSC in his analysis.
When you're actually trying to steer that as the clerk or the Secretary of Treasury Board, there's a little bit of cat herding or duck herding going on because government departments and agencies actually have an enormous amount of autonomy. And, it's very hard to bring all of the agencies and departments along. So there's a sort of a federal family story there. But I think my theory of the case would be we really have to delve into the federalism side. Our peer group is not Singapore and Estonia. When I look at the tables and there's lots to learn from them, and I've gone to conferences and workshops, the top 10 are dominated by very small unitary states, compact geography, but most importantly, no provinces. So when the central government decides to do something, particularly something like digital ID or credentials, it's done. So I think our peer group is much more Germany, Australia, United States, where the art and science of public administration is about multi-level governance and getting governments aligned. So we just can't do the kind of things they do in unitary states, trying to line up social assistance delivered with the provinces, with employment insurance delivered by the federal government, health data, which is generated by provinces and even, local authorities with, other forms of data. So it's always been a challenge getting data to connect, getting systems to connect. There are legitimate concerns about data sovereignty and privacy and all those sorts of things. So it's always going to be a federalism puzzle, in Canada.
Well, okay, I want to test a hypothesis with you then. Because from what you're saying and from other research I've done, it sounds almost like we were an early mover. We were one of the early ones to jump on to e-government and realize that the internet's something important that we should really leverage. And we already had decent infrastructure, recently high digital literacy within the population because we're a fairly well-educated country, which made it easy for us to make the sort of first mover advantage. But then we started running into some, security breakdowns. You mentioned Nortel as an example, but then also you just were talking about how at the federalist level, provincially particularly, we ran into some significant hiccups around, for example, e-health, and that those things caused us to pump the brakes and slow down while the rest of the world was just stepping on the gas and accelerating. And maybe is that an accurate sort of layout of what could be one of the reasons why we've dropped in the rankings?
Yeah, I think that's plausible, although, it's not that other countries didn't have their setbacks and scandals as well. If you look around, there's some clangers in the UK and in Germany and so on. So everybody's sort of, had their missteps along the way.
Was there anything significant from your perspective that happened around 2010 to shift things? Because that's where it looks like things shifted. And I don't know if that's something domestically that happened or internationally that happened. I'm trying to peel that apart.
Not specifically. I mean, what I remember, and I did look up a few of the dates, so ballpark accuracy, we're still in that sort of first and second generation internet wave. Around 2008-9 is when you see things emerge in internal to government. That whole GC Tools suite, GC Connects, GCpedia, GC Collab emerged around 2009, 2010. Did change, a number of things. You're familiar with some of that. The consolidation of IT, certainly data centers and networks and email, was a creature of that period, and it kind of culminated in creating Shared Services Canada around 2011. I know, that's not everybody's cup of tea, but I think that was the only the only path available at the time to actually get an upgrade and investment in government IT. There's a parallel agenda around open data and open government. The open government agenda really took off around 2011, 2012. So, I think there's a fair bit of momentum probably into about 13, 14. The one big thing I can, sort of triggers flashbacks to is 2012, 2013 brings a big slamming of the fiscal brakes. So, that is the deficit reduction action plan. That is when there was a fair bit of dialing back of operating budgets and I think a little bit of a retreat from, investment.
Okay, so another quick sidebar. The Deficit Reduction Action Plan, and it came out in the 2012 federal budget as a key project under Prime Minister Stephen Harper. The goal was to reduce the government's expenditure by shrinking the workforce. And to this end, it was really successful. It led to a reduction of 19,000 public service positions, accounting for 5% of the workforce at the time, and it did this through attrition and layoffs. It's quite controversial. It is seen as the dark days of being a public servant. And it led to not just a reduction in workforce, but also a huge loss of institutional memory and a big hit to morale within the public service. And in the context of this conversation, as Michael talks about, it really froze a lot of the innovation that was happening around digital transformation and really slowed things down.
There's a problem we may see again, which is, investments in things that are called back office, often get labeled as overhead. And so, the Department of Finance and Treasury Board are looking for savings. And they're very, very hard to convince to make investments in things like IT systems and interoperability and information management systems and all those sorts of things. We see the Digital Academy, a lot of effort on training public servants in digital and data emerging around 17, 18, 19. The pay system, blowing a tire in 2016 caused an enormous chill effect on risk taking. It became a metaphor, and within departments and at the Treasury Board table, business cases making investments in IT solutions would immediately be asked, well, is this another Phoenix? And I think it just threw an ice bucket on risk taking that lasted at least until the pandemic.
All right, I got to do another quick sidebar here because the Phoenix pay system is the biggest IT disaster, at least within the last couple of decades within the Government of Canada. So in 2016, the Government of Canada decided it wanted to modernize its pay system, probably well overdue, and so they brought in IBM to develop and implement this pay system that was called the Phoenix pay system. And needless to say that the implementation went very, very poorly. It impacted over 80% of public servants in one way or another, and this impact led to everything from people being overpaid or underpaid or not paid at all. Basically, any time you had any type of change into your job in some way or another, you got promoted, you went on parental leave, anything like that, you knew something was going to happen to your pay. And it really was quite stressful for public servants. And ended up costing the government millions and millions of dollars to fix and became synonymous with IT disasters. And as Michael mentioned, really poured a bucket of cold ice on any type of change that was happening, particularly anything tied to IT. Is this going to be another Phoenix? It put the fear of God into senior leaders in government and really slowed things down. That's interesting. So if you map it out, we had some serious sort of wobbles that happened in the space, DRAP being one, and like the budget cuts that really held things back. And then, of course, I remember Phoenix very well, something that froze things down.
I think what also happened, and it's interesting because you made me think about this a bit, is what we went through, in the sort of the Harper years, this is I think unintentional, is the strategic review cycle, which people may be triggered on, put individual departments vertically through a review. What are your priorities? What's your lowest ranking 5 or 10% of spending and so on? And, I went through that when I was at Aboriginal and Northern Affairs and so on. That's the predecessor to DRAP. That inadvertently kind of reinforced the verticality of government departments, looking at health as health, employment as employment. And I think there was a loss of momentum on what the Brits would call joined up government because of that. I can't prove that, but I think until the pandemic came along, and then the pendulum sort of swung back towards whole of government, joined up government kind of thinking. And that's a danger in the next spending review, is if they don't do it right, it's just going to actually drive people back into their stovepipes.
I was just going through the numbers here of seeing like how the drop happened Or, like, I'm just thinking, like, when did the drop really happen? I mean, it's a hard because it's a relative ranking.
Yeah, and
It's
you're
not just
also
pieces.
I would assume in most rankings, what you're doing is you're capturing a snapshot, which is a lagged picture, kind of like astronomy, of
Yeah.
things that happened in the previous 2 or 3 years starting to manifest and so on. There'll always be a bit of a lagged effect before you nudge the the rankings.
Are there other things that happened during this period?
If you dial it, take your lens back a bit, people will divide the Trudeau years into three parts: first mandate, second mandate, third mandate. I can only really speak to the first mandate. And I think there was a lot of progress on a number of fronts. I can go through a range of things. The government was able to, push the envelope on all kinds of areas and started to make some progress, I think, on the internal workings of government. Second mandate's the pandemic. Everything's about the pandemic, and that has its own stories. And then the third mandate, there is a noticeable loss of momentum and traction by the Trudeau government, and on everything. So I can give you a long list of things they said they would do and didn't get to the finish line. So in some ways, it's not surprising. I think what's interesting is it shows only a really loose correlation with titles and sort of the symbolic politics of having somebody tag you're the Minister of Digital Government and so on. I worked closely with Scott Bryson at the Treasury Board before he was named Minister of Digital Government, and I think he made an enormous impact in nudging things along. There have been ministers since who've officially had the title Minister of Digital Government, a couple of them actually, and we had a bespoke Minister of Citizen Services for a couple of years, in 2023 and 2024. So, and we've had chief information officers and chief data officers and chief transformation officers popping up all over the place within the public service. Having a focal point or having somebody with the title may be necessary, but it's clearly not sufficient. So there's something about, the Harper years, and I would argue the early Trudeau years, where there was focus and attention, that generated some momentum. I'm not sure there's an obstacle or setback so much as just a kind of drag effect and a loss of forward momentum.
I mean, the thing I always found interesting, like my first assumption when I went into this before I actually started doing research is that the shift, a lot of this to be aligned with when different parties came in, right? Because we
Mhm.
had some significant swings, like when Harper came in after Chrétien Martin, like that was a significant shift. And then when Trudeau came in 2016, like that was another major shift, right? But that had no alignment at all with this, and that surprised me at first, which I thought was interesting, particularly on the Trudeau front, because Trudeau came in, at least my perception of it was he came in very much a younger leader, much more comfortable with digital, and it wasn't just him. His whole entire cabinet was a younger cabinet. And I mean, when Scott Bryson came in, I mean, I can tell you on the ground floor, he was really popular with those of us in the OCIO, the Office of Chief Information Officer. And then, like, with that energy, we created Canadian Digital Services and, with the GC tools and all this stuff. There just seemed to be all this momentum, but that momentum didn't seem to translate. Like, the time period I'm talking about is also when you have some of the low scores, like when we dropped down to 82% from the 84 it was before. And that's the thing I'm trying to figure out is, like, why is it that despite this momentum, this new generational leadership, the much more digitally focused leadership, digital minister for the first time ever, CDS, like, why did that not translate? What am I missing here?
Yeah. I don't know that I have an answer to that because, I mean, the way it gets experienced internally is much more about specific services or departments or pain points for the government. And so you would see, a sort of an arc around the tax system, which is the one that people most interact with, and the delivery of benefits like the carbon rebate and so on, reaching levels of speed and accuracy and customization that we couldn't have even imagined in the 2010s. So again, you're chasing rising expectations. You see the introduction of facial recognition technology and pre-screening and, in the border services, advanced travel authorizations, Parks Canada starting to bring in, an app-based reservation system for campsites. This is the way it gets experienced by the cabinet table, right? And there are always sort of people, organizations out at the front of that, and then the stragglers in behind who just can't seem to get enough attention or, and so on. So my theory of the case is The loss of momentum on internal services, records management, information management, digital ID, interoperability of information systems, the hard slog of database government is really where we started to lose momentum. And other governments clearly were able to make faster progress on that, partly because they were unitary states, sometimes because they were more authoritarian states. You're never going to get a national ID card in Canada. So you've got to look for workarounds through interoperability and digital, ID verification and so on. So I don't know. I mean, I think you get to Treasury Board ministers by presenting a use case around something that they can touch and feel. And it's very hard to get through to them, with general strategies and investments.
So I know I want to dive in deeper to the Fed Prov dynamics because I know it's something that you've played in previously. But before we get to that, Shared Services Canada.
Mhm.
So this was in some ways the big bet, or a big bet that the government made to really transform how its digital infrastructure and its digital service delivery. Obviously very controversial.
Mhm.
What impact do you think Shared Services Canada had on this?
I
Positively,
think
negatively, in general?
Well, I mean, I'm a hawk on shared services. I don't think there was another path or another option. I mean, hindsight's perfect, but the context in 2009, 2010, you can read Auditor General chapters about the state of government IT and at the time. We were not going to be able to get the cybersecurity perimeters and firewalls. We're not going to be able to get the data centers for cloud computing. We're not, we weren't going to get the kind of interoperable networks if we asked 300 organizations to go one at a time over the trench line to be mowed down at Treasury Board. Like it just wasn't going to happen. That's a system that works well for the big players. DRA would have figured a way, CBSA would have figured a way, the central agencies would have looked after their own needs, but hundreds of organizations would have been sitting there, waiting. And then there's a recurrent pattern, which you can find in the Auditor General's chapters of the half measures. There are Auditor General chapters that time and time again have said, you launched this initiative with, objectives and ambitions, and then you didn't give it the resources to get it done. And that's just a reflexive thing the Department of Finance does. Red, blue, whatever, majority, minority. And I think that's a structural problem. Is they will say no matter how much costing or diligence you come in and you ask for X, and they'll give you 2/3 of X. And then nobody should be surprised that there are problems years later. So finding a better approach to costing, project management, gating, is part of the puzzle here, right? This kind of predefining projects with very elaborate kind of specifications and asking for precision of costing, which is just unrealistic, and then sort of going all, double or nothing. I think that there's been some progress on that, in terms of, the procurement model, the contracting model, certainly, has to be more iterative and more gated on, when you're talking about the risk of IM and IT projects. And you have to admit there's a range of error and a range of costing. And you need a governance system where there's a feedback loop to say, am I on track? Am I off track? Can I make the adjustments and so on? I'm a big fan of the book, How Big Things Get Done. And, sort of the project management is a big part of all this. I think we're at a very strange place going into the election because all the parties reacted to, ArriveCan and the sort of criticisms of McKinsey and so on to say, we're going to, cut back on using outside contractors. That's a bad thing. And I just wonder, so how are you going to get to next generation digital government if you're not going to the firms and the people that have worked with big tech and retailers and consumers and financial institutions about customer relationships and service and all the other things, if you're not prepared to learn from them? Furthermore, if you want to import a lot of this work and get it done by public servants, which is what the politicians are saying, where's the investment in training of public servants then? Like they're not carrying around that leading edge know-how, some are. If you really want to inshore a lot of this to the public service, we're going to have to double the investment in training from what it is now.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I hadn't even thought about the whole ArriveCan stuff and its impact on this. I mean, this has been much more recent. In some ways, that's also like where we're going, because, okay, we're 47th now. And maybe that's, I'll get to that in a second. I want to ask you about the FedProv. So you've worked in the FedProv space for a bit as well. I mean, I think I think it was in the 90s or I think it was maybe even early before then.
Yeah, Charlottetown Accord and the Quebec referendum.
Yeah, very quiet, easy basic times to be involved in Fed-Prov relations. Nothing really happened in the 90s. It was quiet.
The last time the country's existence was in question. But
From that experience, what did you learn that you think, like the Fed-Prov relationship around digital infrastructure and digital service delivery, I think is a key factor in our rankings, the why they are the way they are. What factors do you think contribute to that, and what can we do differently?
yeah, it's an enormous question. I mean, I think, it is something that we simply have to, work through. It's a good thing we're a federation. There's a lot of advantages. It's how we've stuck together for 158 years, and will continue to. But you buy for that some issues in alignment of what levels of government are doing. And I'd throw in local, regional, and increasingly indigenous governments into the mix. So it's a complicated puzzle. I guess what what I would have learned is it is possible for levels of government to work together in a positive way, even if the politics at the top level is, adversarial and a bit theatrical. I was there, when the Harper government was facing the McGuinty government in Ontario, and we got a lot of stuff done, with the government of Ontario when I was at Indian and Northern Affairs. Public servants working together can do a lot of problem solving and stay away from the sort of political crossfire. But the provinces, as I was alluding to earlier, they own some of the most change-resistant parts of the public sector. Schools, school boards, universities, colleges, courts, policing. These are sort of guild and union-driven entities that are very, very hard to change. But provincial premiers have the same incentive. If they don't provide, health and education services or transportation services, or, local councils don't get the garbage picked up properly, there will be voter feedback. So, they have the right incentive structure. I just think they're dealing with a much more change-resistant part of the public sector. The pandemic helped break some of that, sort of inertia, create some possibilities. And I think, what we definitely learned is you're not going to have the sort of the one big system, the one ring to, rule them all. That's never going to happen. Because the government of New Brunswick is going to want its branding and visibility and feedback, on top of the service window. Where the sort of the zone for progress is, as far as I can tell, is much more on interoperability, on digital identity, on credentials, one key, no wrong way to sign in, no wrong pathway kinds of approaches, where, behind the sort of front counters or at the front counters, it shouldn't really matter. I'm going on a trip. What do I need to do? I had a new child. What do I need to do? And slowly but surely, there has been a lot of progress on that. Going forward, I think it's worth like a First Ministers Conference, frankly, or the Council of the Federation, which has been around for a long time, to align the premiers around common agendas. They could have a meeting on, improving the public sector instead of just what they usually do, which is give the federal government advice. But anyway, and and a lot of what people care about, they experience through their local and municipal governments. And
Well, and I mean, this is I guess the question of like where do we go from here? Does the current context with this drive towards government efficiency create an opportunity for like what's the opportunity space that we have right now? There's also a huge risk with it.
yeah,
I mean, we're in the middle of a trade war. The cuts we've been talking about cuts. I mean, you and I have been talking about cuts in government going back probably a couple of years now. We know they're happening. It's not even they're coming. They're currently happening, and this is just tip of the iceberg of what we're expecting. Although, of course, what's happening in the States right now is changing everything. So who knows? What do you see as the path forward? What steps can Canada take now, given the current context, so that when you and I sit down and say a year from now or 2 years from now, we're not talking about Canada being 47th. We're talking about Canada being much higher than that.
yeah. I mean, I think that it's uncertain. Things may get worse. They can get better. That probably captures a lot of things. But whoever we elect on April 28th, I will continue to sort of advocate that they make the public sector part of their agenda, not what they're going to ask public services to do, but how the public service works, and to make renewal or renovation part of the agenda. If you want to approach it from a fiscal or body count kind of perspective, that's fine. Then it's pruning, but preferably careful, deliberate pruning and not chainsaws. if you want to approach it as technology transformation, that's, and what do we do with AI? That's fine. And if you want to approach it as sort of updating the structures and the core software, from the 90s model, that's fine too. I'm kind of an advocate of everything everywhere all at once, and that this should be a priority. And it really shouldn't matter, as you were alluding to earlier, if you're sort of a neoconservative small government, that's fine if that's what we pick. And if you have a more expansionist sort of government, that's fine too. Both sides want government to work well, or the voters are going to throw them out eventually. So, I think they have the right incentives, and I don't see anybody other than a few of the tech bros in Canada advocating the sort of Musk, Doge, approach to things. So there is a possibility. The traps would be, stupid cutting, where you cut back on hiring, you cut back on training, you cut back on technology investment, and you actually set things back. You drive people back into vertical stovepipes. That would not be, not be smart. Relying on attrition is a really dumb way to approach downsizing government, because that just means a hiring freeze. Well, how's that going to make anything better? So we could take some bad paths. And the other trap, which I know will get me in trouble with some of your listeners, is this kind of, we have to start making everything ourselves and buy from Canadian sources. That can be a trap too. We've seen that in the past, the championing of BlackBerry and the championing of Corel and so on. There are good reasons for doing that, but in the end, we didn't give public servants the best technology, and we built silos among systems and so on. So I hope we're not going to go with the sort of, picking winners, champion firms kind of approach, to becoming more autonomous.
Michael, any final thoughts from your perspective?
My bottom line on this is the rankings are always interesting. They tell you something about direction and relativity, and they can give people a kick in, the pants to aspire to more ambition. So I don't welcome it. I'm not going to argue about the rankings per se, but given who we are, our size, our geography, and path dependency from what we've done, and our federal system, we're going to have to figure this out fairly quickly and chart a made in Canada strategy, learning from Singapore and the UK and others. But ultimately, we're going to have to figure this out among ourselves.
Amazing. Well, let's cap it at that. Thank you so much, Michael, for making time and joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the interest, and I look forward to the rest of the series.